Hello, I'm David Hunt, owner of GameMasters Guild, and today I want to welcome you back to another episode of The Art of the Master. In this episode, I'm going to talk about unique places for adventure. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the open ocean. Now, before I get started, you don't have to worry about watching this video. Feel free just to let it run in the background. I'm going to have a little visual ambiance for this video, but nothing you have to pay attention to. So whether you're working on schoolwork, cleaning around the house, driving to or from work or school, or just trying to kill a rainy day, sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of The Art of the Master, Unique Places for Adventure. So as I said earlier, we're going to look at the open sea. Now, there is a lot of adventure potential in the open sea. Now, instantly, images of giant krakens and giant sharks will probably fill your head. However, there's a lot of other things than monsters on the open sea. Sure, there are giant whirlpools and rogue waves, but before I get ahead of myself, let's go ahead and see exactly where we can go on the open sea. Now, of course, there's islands, but, well, in every fantasy game, if you go sailing on the open sea, you're going to eventually run across an island with a port town. And I won't say that they're the same, because they're not, but they're not unique enough, or oftentimes they're fairly stereotypical. Even in my games, a lot of times, a port city on an island is kind of the usual fare. However, how can we change this up for our players? And even for you as the dungeon master, how can we make it more unique? Well, let's take a look at maybe a city on the sea comprised of dozens of galleons and or other sailing vessels. Why are they there? Perhaps they're pirates, refugees, or merchants. Maybe they're part of a bigger cult, a worldwide cult, and all their ships gather there for safety, security, and privacy. Maybe it's a scholarly group that's there for research. Maybe in their own lands, their research is forbidden. Or maybe it's just an easy way to get access to information. Or also a large group of vessels that are kind of a city on the sea. They could be a good way for a sorcerer's guild to practice their magics away from prying eyes, especially of other guild houses. And also, too, for any of these groups, what's nice about having a city on the open sea is it's pretty easy to see people coming from a far way off. Doesn't matter if they're sailing or flying, and sure, there's lots of other ways. Perhaps someone could magically come in from under the water, or perhaps they're invisible. But generally speaking, they're going to see most people or creatures who are going to be a threat coming from a mile off. Or, I'm sorry, even miles off. So the open sea affords some protection. Now also, too, even if someone were to figure out exactly where this floating city was, all these ships could easily unlash themselves from each other and simply sail away to another location. And they don't even have to all go in the same direction. They could all split up, sail away, and regroup later at a predetermined time and place. So you could make this as big or as small as you wanted to. It could be as permanent or non-permanent as you wanted to. If you want to make it permanent, well, then the ships eventually, it was maybe early on, just a few ships lashed together, and eventually it just grew and grew and grew, and to the point to where ships in the middle can no longer leave. So it's become literally a floating city. However, if you like to go a little more looser route, like I mentioned earlier, the ships meet and they temporarily form this city. They could literally be just anchored around each other. It could be a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen ships anchored nearby, and it's easy enough to swim or row over in a small skiff or rowboat to one of the other ships. Or they could go broadside against each other and actually put planks from one ship to the other And there'd be pretty long planks to kind of account for a little bit of drift, but they would generally lash themselves together and have some kind of buffer between them. In modern day terms, you'd look at like how ships are docked now. They have tires thrown over the side of their vessels or some other kind of removable bumper so the ship doesn't bump another ship and damage itself or the other vessel or the dock itself. So you could do something similar in a fantasy setting. I'd imagine it would just be perhaps another log or something like that attached to rope or chains that could be lowered and raised whenever ready. So a city on the sea, there's a lot of potential for players to make contacts with other people from other lands and get items that might be difficult to acquire elsewhere, and they might have to go no further than a little ways off the coast. So this is always something to consider. Of course, there's a lot of danger with having a city on the sea like this. You are exposed and vulnerable, and of course there is always the weather to consider. Hurricanes, sudden whirlpools, tsunamis, but for a vessel in the open ocean, a tsunami isn't really much of a problem unless you're closer to shore. The big problem would be rogue waves, and that's a wave that just suddenly appears out of nowhere due to other conditions elsewhere in the ocean, and these waves, if you're not facing into the wave, these waves can easily tower over the ship and topple it and sink it. Now, another idea to create a city on the open sea would be, let's say, there's a dangerous reef. And initially how the city starts is that ships just run aground on this reef. And let's say it's near a popular shipping lane. That's why they keep running across it. In bad weather or due to poor navigation, ships run aground on it sometimes. So you could easily say that a prosperous merchant runs aground on this reef, and his ship gets stuck solid. It's not really in danger of being torn apart anymore, but it's definitely, unless a big storm comes by, but it's definitely not going to be going anywhere anytime soon, and at least not without great resources put to trying to remove it from the reef. But let's say this prosperous merchant decides to keep his ship there, and if he's traveling with a convoy of other vessels, he could send his other vessels for additional supplies to reinforce that vessel on the reef to help protect it during storms. So now he's got a structure actually affixed to the reef itself. And it's not too hard to imagine other ships that run aground. Well, he could easily buy these ships or salvage these ships and add that to his ship and the reef that's there. And he could continue to create a larger and larger place for other ships to come by, stop, and buy and sell goods. So if this reef is a reasonable distance offshore, it might be a prime place as a way station for other sailing vessels. A nice rest area for the crew of these vessels to stop off, stretch their legs, get some different food, different sights, relax, get restocked, and then continue on their way. Now, if this kind of structure is closer to land, it'd be an excellent place for pirates to offload their questionable goods, and then that way whoever this merchant is that has his own little kind of, I guess, literally giant store, little mini town right there on the reef, then it would be up to them to transfer things to the coast clandestinely. And of course, it just doesn't have to be the one prosperous merchant. It could be a prosperous merchant who started the idea, and then someone comes by and says, hey, I want to share in this reef too. What if I put a tavern next to you? And they come up with an agreement. Next thing you know, someone they calculate it and they plan it, and they actually purposely run a ship aground on this reef, and they secure it to the other ship. And next thing you know, you have the merchant's vessel that's there to do business. Then you have a tavern, a vessel that's there strictly as a tavern. And then this could just keep happening and happening until pretty soon the whole reef is its own little town, its own little city, depending on how big you want the reef and how many ships you want on it. And what's nice is the reef, it could easily drop off into deep water relatively quickly. So other ships could either come broadside to another ship that's just off of the reef, Or maybe they could lower a rowboat or some other skiff and row over to this little city on the sea made of all these galleons or other vessels run ashore on the reef. Now, I imagine that a lot of these vessels would be bigger vessels like galleons and these huge barks and stuff like that. But it could even be smaller ships too. There is no reason why you couldn't have all these smaller ships set up on a reef like this. And I think this is definitely something very, very unique for the players to see. And also, too, something to where they can see that, sometimes good can come of a bad situation. A ship runs aground on a reef. Hey, this guy turned a lemon into lemonade. And that might even inspire the players to do something similar. Plus, maybe someone would want to do that because it's outside the territorial waters of maybe a coastal city who decides that maybe they don't like magic. So you can't get magic items there. But everybody goes out to this reef at this semi-permanent settlement to get all their magic goods and then go back. Everybody knows it's there, but it's outside the waters, so the territorial waters of the city, so nobody cares. But then again, everybody goes out there to deal, and everybody knows what's going on, but nobody does anything about it. So just something to consider, something different. I just thought of what a way to make an opportunity if you were a prosperous fantasy merchant. And sure, it'd be annoying if you ran aground on a reef during a storm and you couldn't get your goods to shore even though it's inside of you. And sure, you could wait for another passing ship to come assist you. But what a cool idea to kind of set up like a little mini way station. Plus, if you had competition on shore, you could actually cut the competition off a little bit because vessels don't have to sail quite as far. You could be more lax in your rules and regulations, and maybe you could offer better deals. So you could actually subvert some of your competition by being just off the coast. Or even, and of course, if you're even further off in deeper water, it could be even better because, again, you're like an entire little way station for other sailing vessels. Of course, a nice thing about the high sea is that your players can literally go anywhere. You can go to one of these floating cities or reef cities. I say city, but the actual size, you could really be whatever you want. There's all sorts of islands they could go to. They could go to cold environments. They go to desert. They could sail to desert environments, jungle islands. It's just the possibilities are endless. You could have volcanic islands. You could have islands that are just almost right at sea level, and they're just all marsh and brine, with settlements that maybe are temporary at best. And every few years, when a hurricane comes through, it just wipes the settlement off, and then perhaps that low-lying marsh island stays vacant for a few years until some other people decide to settle there. But this is pretty standard fare, and it's cool. But I was thinking the other day, where else could we sail that is super unique that maybe many people haven't considered? Well, let's take a look at the Underdark. Now, the Underdark is vast. Now, when you go underground, people always think of these confining spaces, or at most, giant cavernous areas, where you can typically see from one side to the other, with stalagmites and great stalagmites and stalactites coming down. And in large drow cities, these are easily converted and hollowed out into structures, into living structures. But not too many consider, and in all the games that I've usually played, most have, the Underdark, and they have the confined, tight tunnels, and you don't know which way's up, you don't know which way you're going. Then they have the large open cavernous areas where you have pockets of civilization. But I don't see too many people really working from the undersea angle. Why not? Why can't you have a great, vast, undersea, underdark ocean? And just imagine you could easily come out of a tunnel that you've been walking for miles, and you could easily hear something familiar, the sound of waves crashing on the shore. And wouldn't your players be surprised when their suspicions were true and they come out on a mostly rocky, somewhat sandy beach, and they realize through faint luminescence that before them lays a giant ocean as far as the eye can see and even beyond. Now, what provides the light? Well, this is all for effect, of course, but the ocean is rife with microorganisms that luminesce. Perhaps there's something in the water that as the waves crash, the organisms are disturbed, so they luminesce with the bioluminescence. They glow slightly. And whatever color you want to, you could do, but blues and greens would be appropriate. And also, maybe all the rocks around the ocean, and even up above on the cavern ceiling, maybe they're covered in a very thin, luminescent fungi of sorts. And especially if you wanted to give the illusion of being outside, but yet the players know that they're in a cavern, you could have this luminescent fungi spread all across the cavernous ceiling. In some spots, the players wouldn't even see anything because either it's too high or there's no fungi there. The luminescing fungi would actually kind of almost look like the night sky in a way. If you had a giant patch of it, it could almost look like a moon, and since these things don't move, and they'd be very different from place to place to place, they'd almost be able to use these stars to navigate by, so-called stars to navigate by in the Underdark. Now, of course, it would always be dark. You would never have a, sunrise or sunset. But I think that would be kind of neat. And what's cool is the cavern doesn't have to be very tall. Imagine they're sailing, and at some point, the lookout cries out, and as they're sailing, they see that the cavern ceiling comes down, and it comes down so low that maybe their mast is inches from touching the ceiling. But it's still this vast ocean. Imagine sailing on the open sea. You can't see land anywhere, but you have the ceiling coming down, the stone ceiling above you. How weird and alien is that? Think about that. And you got this luminous fungi all over the ceiling, illuminating the ocean and your vessel and your sailing. And everybody can watch as the ship sails underneath this ceiling, and they can just see that the mast is inches from touching the ceiling, and they have to be careful. So instead of trying to navigate the reefs that might pop up in a regular ocean or even in this Underdark ocean, they have to kind of navigate the ceiling or risk their mast getting torn off or damaged. And ships that would ply these waterways frequently in these areas would already be prepared for such a thing, whereas if the players weren't aware of where they were going or got a ship inappropriate for where they were going, they wouldn't even realize that they would need a special ship, or at least a ship with shorter masts, to get under that ceiling. And of course, you ask, masts? Are you kidding me? Where are they going to get air from the Underdark? Not to worry. I'm coming up to that. But let's just think about this though at first. Just the visual of sailing this undersea ocean, stalagmites coming up sharply out of the ocean floor, and you could still have these little reef spots or these little boulders sticking up. You could have deep parts of the ocean. You could have parts of it where the ocean isn't very deep. It's like 30 or 50 feet deep. Have the ceiling come down, or even if the ceiling's high enough, you could have these great stalactites come down, or you could have it to where the stalactites and stalagmites have met. You could have these outposts on these stalactites and stalagmites. It's just a fascinating, intriguing idea. You can still have your islands. You can still have an island right in the middle of everything, but it's mostly going to be rocky, and it might have some, over the thousands of years it's been there, some detritus that eventually, there is a little bit of dirt and some plant life, that's growing there. Or maybe it's been imported from above, or maybe a sinkhole centuries or tens of thousands of years ago happened and has since sealed up, and a lot of that dirt from the surface has fallen on this giant rock island, but that's where these plants and things can grow, or maybe people can have actually a farm there. So now, I did say something about wind. How is a sailing ship going to get propelled in the Underdark? Well, there are temperature differences in the Underdark. And we have temperature difference, the wind moves. You have varying sizes of tunnels all around. So there's no reason why you couldn't have a wind in such a vast area. It could be fairly consistent. It could be very inconsistent. And the actual physics of it, I'm not 100% sure. But it's a fantasy setting, so I'm not going to think too hard about it. But it seems reasonable to me that there can be drafts. You can get airflow. Even if where the air is flowing out to or flowing in from is hundreds of miles away, there are still going to be forces that are going to allow these breezes to occur. So, out of all these tunnels, little cracks and holes everywhere, giant tunnels coming out near this giant Underdark sea, that's where you're going to get your breeze from. That's where you're going to get your air from. Now, I do like the idea that the wind would be very, very erratic. So it seems to me that a lot of sailing vessels in this Underdark Ocean, or on this Underdark Ocean, would probably come equipped already with oars. Almost standard fare. You have sails and it's meant to sail, but your odds of becoming becalmed at sea are greater, so there's always oars. And of course, you could always get by with a ship without sails or without oars, but you're really not maximizing your potential. So that's something to think about. Just think about how different it would be. And especially in areas where there's a really low ceiling, ship with oars would be perfect, whereas another ship with masts would be disabled, especially if they didn't have any oars. And if you're sailing in a large open part of that ocean where the winds blow more frequently, then you might not need to worry about oars. And if you get off course or get lost, then you could be in big trouble. So speaking of wind, that also means you could have great gusts of wind that could be potentially dangerous, perhaps even hurricane strength. Now, these probably wouldn't be sustained winds, or if they were sustained, maybe it's cyclic. Maybe they're sustained winds for always a week at a time, and then they're gone for a month or so. But I like to think that while these winds vary in strength, that if they become very erratic, they could be hurricane strength, like hurricane 4 or 5 strength suddenly, just out of nowhere, a calm sea, and then suddenly this wind blows that's so dangerous that it could topple your vessel. It could destroy you. And possibly, with these winds crisscrossing from all sorts of different tunnels and cracks and fissures, perhaps waterspouts are much more common in the Underdark. So you could hear this rumbling, thundering sound combined with this whooshing of water as somewhere in the darkness a waterspout is spinning, maybe coming towards your vessel or going away from it. Who knows? Imagine trying to describe that to your players and taking your time doing so and unnerving them, because in this dark undersea, you're not going to hardly be able to see anything. And even players with night vision or magic abilities to see in the dark, they're only going to be able to see so far. They're literally navigating by these moss structures, these luminescent moss-like structures on the ceiling, and whatever's sticking out of the actual undersea itself. Other than that, you're sailing pretty much in pitch blackness. I'm telling you, I want to run a game right now because this is really cool. I'm really enjoying it. And so moving on, I'm even thinking about not just the wind, but how could I recreate in this Underdark sea, how could I recreate weather from above? Well, rain is easy because what's above will eventually come down. Gravity will pull it down. Maybe there's a sinkhole and water will literally whoosh down into the Underdark, and then it hits a layer of rock and it pools up, and eventually it starts to drip through all these cracks and pores. And so there's literally probably sections of this Underdark sea where you could be sailing and you always get a light rain because of the trickle down of water from above. Or maybe sometimes it doesn't come down as a trickle, it comes down as a steady downpour all the time. And there may even be times where it just opens up and it just crashes down, almost like a waterfall from the ceiling. You could be sailing and a giant waterfall just suddenly starts and instantly drowns your vessel, just swamps it, and it sinks. You could have these giant waterfalls open up suddenly, or maybe and disappear just as suddenly, or maybe these waterfalls from the ceiling could be something that helps feed the underground sea, and they're always there. And they don't have to be small. I mean, it sure could be big enough to engulf a vessel, but it could literally be like a wall of water falling from the ceiling all the time in a continuous cycle. And you'd think, well, wouldn't that eventually drain the ocean? Well, yeah, but there's forces on Earth that work all the time where water is evaporating and draining away from the ocean, and then, but all that water is raining back down and coming back to it. It's always a cycle with these things. So is things like this in the Underdark. And you got to keep that sea fed. So why not have these cool effects to mimic rain and storms from above? And I also think it's more unique when you have this giant curtain of water and the players wonder, well, we could circumvent it and it would take us a month to sail around this, but can we sail through it? Maybe the curtain of water, maybe it's not too thick, or maybe the downpour, it's unlike anything they've ever seen on the surface, but yet they still feel like they can sail through it. So do they take that chance? You know, it's very interesting to consider the possibilities. And I really like the idea of just these massive waterfalls starting and stopping suddenly, or having this giant curtain of water just always there raining down, or even just some single streams of water, literally maybe like 5 or 10 feet in diameter, just in a whole area where it just streams down constantly. And you could also occasionally describe, a sudden splash mixed in with this, as if a giant rock gets dislodged from somewhere above and comes crashing down. And that's always a danger on the undersea, is stuff getting dislodged from above. And water is a great mechanic, a great way to dislodge something and have it come careening down. Well, so is gravity, but they kind of work hand in hand, though. Water and gravity, water's eroding things, gravity's always there pulling it down, water's pushing on something, finally dislodges it. So it's could be very scary for players, especially in an area of instability. So any kind of sinkhole on the surface could rain down debris on any vessel and just utterly destroy it. A lot of scary possibilities. Describing such things would make any player a little nervous about being here, and I think this environment would be even more challenging than being on the open sea. You could have another section of the undersea, and I talk about having sections in the undersea where all these things happen, but remember, these things can be easily as vast as the ocean above. You could have a section of the undersea where you could have steaming shallows, where let's say it's only maybe 30 or 50 or 100 feet deep, but just below the undersea floor, perhaps there's lava moving, there's magma chambers, so this whole section of the ocean is constantly steaming, and the water is almost boiling, or it is boiling. So anyone thrown overboard would be burned boiled alive if they didn't get out in time. And even if they weren't, it'd be very uncomfortable. It'd be like being in a hot tub too long. They could get scalded. It'd be hot and humid, and it'd be dark. It'd be foggy. You couldn't hardly see anything. And something else that could happen too is there could be these sudden boiling geysers that could explode from underneath, showering everybody on deck with boiling water. And now you end up having to fight another crew from another ship in one of these kind of environments. Someone falls overboard or a boiling geyser happens while you guys are fighting. This is just insane. It's craziness is what it is. It's almost as if you're on another plane, but you're not. You're still on Faerun, you're still in the Underdark, you're still in this undersea ocean, and it's crazy, and I love it. Let's see, something else that I did mention is stuff falling from the ceiling. You could easily have not just chunks of rock falling, but you could have a great stalactite from the ceiling break loose and come down and create rogue waves that I talked about earlier. And those rogue waves could smash vessels or destroy coastal communities, could create a tsunami. The stalactite itself could easily smash vessels. And for that matter, even just rock slides from the sides of the caverns or islands within the undersea could cause a disturbance to create a tsunami hundreds of miles away, thousands of miles away, wiping out coastal communities. Problems above, so below. So you get all the dangers of the ocean above, but they're even magnified here in the Underdark, especially since everything is dark for starters. And even with night vision, you're not going to see very far. With 120 feet, 200 feet max, this is definitely a very dangerous environment for any players, any vessels. Something else to consider too is that, let's say the players are sailing along, and at any time, mind you, the ceiling can literally come down and meet the ocean. Almost as if, it was part of a giant stalactite. I mean, for 50 miles, you could have the ceiling literally down and meet the ocean floor and disappear into the sea and meet the ocean floor. And the players have to sail around it. There's no way through it. But what if the players came to one of these giant, we'll just call it a stalactite, I guess, meeting the ocean floor, it's 50 miles wide. What if they sail to it and instead of going around it, there's some tunnels that they could sail through, massive tunnels, like a mile wide, or maybe instead of a tunnel, it could be looks like a giant crack or crevasse, and looks like it's a mile wide. And what if they sail in and they get to a spot to where it dead ends and they can't turn around, or they get lost in there and there's too many branches and they have trouble navigating? That's something to consider. Or perhaps there's hidden civilizations in these areas. Or let's say they're sailing along the actual wall of one of these underground seas, and let's say there's a great popping noise, sound of stone, and suddenly part of the wall for like a half mile or a mile, or even a few hundred or few thousand feet, maybe it just opens up all of a sudden, and water just starts pouring into this newly open section of the Underdark, and it takes their ship with them. And they flow into this new area, and the water just flows in, carrying their ship to this vast new area and potentially getting the players lost. Maybe they're not in just a new chamber anymore, but they go into this new chamber, and this water just rushes them and sends them down another area, another tunnel, another section, and next thing you know, they're completely lost in the Underdark. They have no way to know how to sail back. And the Underdark can easily be as vast as the world on top. Or even if they're just sailing along and they see these great holes in the side of the cavern of the undersea, they could easily choose to sail in these holes. And maybe people don't like to sail into these holes, into these tunnels going to other sections, because maybe no one comes back. Maybe that's their equivalent of like the Bermuda Triangle, or no one's charted that yet, or it just opened so it doesn't show on the map. It could very easily, the players could have followed this route, because one of the best ways I would think to sail in this environment is if you can follow the cavern wall and find certain civilizations, because if it's just like any other coast, there's going to be communities set up on that coast for fishing. And here, it doesn't have to be a salty sea. It could easily be a freshwater sea. This might be the only source of fresh water in the Underdark for hundreds, maybe thousands of miles of any size anyway. Sure, there's probably trickle here and there, but maybe this is the only sizable freshwater spot anywhere in the Underdark that's nearby. So you're going to have all these coastal communities. So if you follow the cavern wall, you're liable to find some of these coastal communities. So imagine you spend a week sailing, find all these coastal communities, you do your business, you do your adventure, you do your trade, and then you're sailing back. And the same way you've come, a cavern has opened up, and the ocean is poured in, and there's a new area to explore. How interesting would that be? I think that's fascinating myself, just to think about it, the immensity of this, and even being in a galleon, just how small you would feel and how scary it would be in this darkness. It's just fascinating to think about how big you could really make it, how immense it would be, and how mysterious it would be, because you're combining, it's very contrasting, you're combining what you would previously think is a tight, claustrophobic environment being underground, and then you open up to a large cavern where there's a whole civilization, a race of people living, like the drow or maybe kobolds, etc., so on and so forth. But then to come out into this vast ocean, this undersea within the Underdark, where it seems limitless and perhaps even uncharted or not fully charted. Just think of all the mystery and adventure that you could have down there. And you have a lot of control over the weather too. And there could be an area where I could imagine a ship graveyard in shallow water, where these ships try to traverse this area, and they're just all stuck there, just like above, but probably even more so because you have less wave action, so you have less chance for these ships to get knocked loose and smashed and eroded. Once a ship smashes smashes up against one of these shallow reefs, then it's stuck. It's just there. It's trapped. It's not going anywhere. And I could see literally a whole graveyard of ships. Just as you're sailing, just another ship, and then another ship pops out of the darkness, another ship pops out of the darkness. Strange and unusual sounds heard every now and then, combined with water trickling from the ceiling or rocks becoming dislodged. It's very cool. It's a very cool environment, very neat idea. And you could even take a step further if you really wanted to, because in this vast undersea, you could even have a connection to, say, the elemental plane of water, the Sea of Worlds, maybe even the Sea of Ice. Now, you could still make it cold under there, but let's say, even without going to the Sea of Ice, you could still make it cold in the Underdark, because maybe that portion of the Underdark is closer to the northern or southern realms, or the poles, where it gets really cold. So it could be colder down there, and you could have maybe some freezing, potentially, probably not, but it's your game. You can do whatever you want. So you could even have you could sail up to the ocean, and boom, it's completely solid for 100 miles. You can do whatever you want, but I think that'd be kind of cool too. Heck, you could probably even get away with some snow down there if you did it right. I think a lot of your players would probably call you on it, though, and decide that maybe snow and ice underground wouldn't quite be a thing. But I don't know. We've got those. I talked about winds howling in from all directions. Why couldn't you have cold winds howling down and creating these conditions? I think it's plausible, and I would certainly do it. and it's fun anyways. And who's to argue, really? It's your game anyways. I think it'd be really cool. But going back to connecting to other planes, you could totally connect to the plane of water, again, the Sea of Worlds, the Sea of Ice, or the Silt Flats, which is located on the plane of water. You could have icebergs floating in your undersea very easily. And something else you could do, which this is kind of spooky from a player standpoint, would be that maybe, let's say, one of the tunnels that opens up and water flows to a new section suddenly, and the players are caught up in it. Or maybe a pre-existing tunnel where the players decide to sail. What happens is, after a while, the water starts moving faster, the players have no control, and they literally get shot into another plane. But when they do, they actually end up on a waterfall cascading out into, say, the plane of air. Now that's a little devious, and I can just imagine the players looking at me like, what are we supposed to do with this? And literally just imagining their deaths as they're dashed against something in the plane of air. But who knows? Who knows? It's whatever your adventure wants. I just think the possibilities are fascinating. You could really do anything with something so deep, dark, and mysterious as the undersea, we'll call it. And speaking of deep, dark, and mysterious, the last thing I'm going to mention that might be kind of cool to encounter is the river Styx. What if the players found a way that while they're sailing in the undersea, what if they found a way to access the river Styx and only they knew about it? Wouldn't that be interesting? Or if they followed someone and then they realized that they were following them into the river Styx. Now that's kind of fascinating. I really like that idea. Well, and as you can probably tell, I like a lot of the stuff that I've mentioned. It's really cool, and it's definitely something different that I think not only your players, but you will enjoy as well. Consider then, next time you have a game and you decide you want to run a game on the open sea, try to find a ways to see if you can't get your players into the undersea. And if it seems hard to get them underground, you don't have to worry about that, because the players could easily sail into a great storm, and there's something there, the portal. Maybe they end up going into the elemental plane of water, and then from there they end up sailing into the undersea. Or maybe there's a vast whirlpool and it sucks them down into the undersea. Sure, it might badly damage their vessel, and they might have to think fast in order to survive and keep their vessel afloat, but that's all part of the game. If you really work at it, you can get them to the undersea, even if just temporarily. And as always, if your players don't totally go for it, you could easily get them out of there. They don't have to be too far underground, and they could have a little bit of adventure and then get them back on the surface. Not to say you should let your players completely control your game, but if your players aren't having any fun, you're not going to have a lot of fun either. But I definitely don't think they'd be opposed to having a fascinating undersea adventure in the Underdark. So keep it in mind. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Art of the Master. I hope you got a lot of interesting ideas for your next game, and I certainly hope you try, even if just for a little while, even if you just use it as a one-shot. I think you'll get hooked, and I think your players will get hooked. Well, I want to thank you very much for listening to The Art of the Master, Unique Places to Adventure, the Open Sea and the Undersea. I'm David Hunt, owner of GameMasters Guild, telling you to stay safe, play great games, and I'll see you real soon.